All right, folks. So tonight I want to talk about some animal myths. Next month I'm doing animal legends, and as I started to do this, I had a conversation with myself about what the difference was between myths and legends, and I decided the way I was going to narrow my focus was to really talk about. Um, Oops, we're going to come back to that. I did that out of order. Is we're going to really talk about some myths, and so what I really want to focus on is. Um, Ideas or stories about real creatures that are not true. They might have a basis in fact, but they're not true. Um, so, and I think one of the things that's really important sometimes when you hear some amazing things or some extraordinary um, stories about a lot of the plants that we see or the critters that we um, learn about is to use your baloney detector. And I say that in the nicest way possible. If something sounds too good to be true, you're probably not going to do it if it's a business offer or they want you to send money or something like that. And the same should be true with some scientific facts. There can be things that if they just trip a little switch in your head and they say, hey, this doesn't sound right. Listen to that voice. And a lot of times it's not hard to check up on some of these things. And um, as I'm fond of telling my sainted wife, we have this little device in our pocket that has the information of the world at our fingertips, and it's really easy to do a quick check. And sometimes what you'll find is you might still find the incorrect information, and you'll find it on 7 sites all the same way, which means they just cut and paste it from somewhere. But a little bit of digging usually isn't hard to sometimes get to the truth of some of these. So we're going to go through several. But I want to throw this quote up from Carl Sagan because I really appreciate his writings on not just rational thought, but really digging deep into whether something is true or not. And it's that last 5 words there: extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And again, sometimes what we'll find is there is a basis for the myth, although it's not entirely true. And to me, sometimes the truth is actually far more interesting than the exaggerated claim. So we're gonna head on into that. And this is my example of how I went between myth and legend. I spent many years as a Boy Scout, and in my younger years, I may or may not have been slightly annoying to the older members of my troop. And I remember on more than one occasion being threatened with being sent out on a snipe hunt at night, in which they described this fantastical creature that would rip my arm off, which right there told me they probably weren't going to do that because if that was really true, they wouldn't send me out in the dark. Um, but I was the kid in my troop that when they said snipe hunt, I was like, oh, you mean one of these? Because I actually knew what a snipe actually was. I found out really quickly that there weren't a lot of older scouts in my troop that were that interested in birds, and so they looked at me like I had 4 heads and then chose to ignore me. But I've heard a lot about snipe hunts, and I was actually quite thankful that when I went to look up a snipe hunt to get an image, I found more pictures of actual snipes than some fake critter like this little looks like a raccoon rabbit, very brightly winged critter combination or whatever somebody made up there. So this is borderline to me legend and myth because that is obviously not a real character in the middle, but the name does actually belong to an actual bird. And snipe hunting is actually also a sport. There's quite a few pictures of snipe that have been hunted, and so apparently they're a game bird. I'm not sure where if they are in North America, but it might be more of a thing out in the old world. Um, so I can be really personally I can be really picky sometimes about the correct information about whether these stories get spread because I've had people say, what's the harm? Sometimes it's just good, clean fun. And it's like, well, it depends on um, how you take the information, how you use the information, and what decisions that information can inform, or what that decision can cause you to think. Sometimes with animal myths about animals, it can very much run the same kind of lines as stereotypes, which can be very harmful for people, and certainly can negatively inform social interactions and meeting new people and how you treat them. And I feel that sometimes the same thing can happen with with critters. You know, there can be ones that are relatively harmless. They don't change your opinion. They sound really amazing, and then they're not true. And you're like, yeah, well, it didn't, you know, change how I reacted. There are some that can be harmful to the organism because the organism is harmed. Excuse me. The organism can be harmed as a result of the misinformation, one way or another. There can be harm to the person because you take this information and you go with that information, depend on it. It turns out not to be true, and you get hurt. And then there can be harm to both. It can be hurtful to both the people who have that information and to the animals that are a result of that information. Just remembered something. I'm going to exit out here for a second. I'm going to unshare my screen. I'm going to reshare it. I want to make sure I have include computer sound. Make sure you can hear excuse me, something I have later. So here we are. We'll get restarted right on this screen. So I got them broken up into these 4 kinds of categories. And again, if you think of something similar with the group of animals or the specific animal I'm talking about that you want to add or share, please let me know. Or also, if you have a difference of opinion on whether that is in fact harmless or harmful, you know, I appreciate that too. There are a couple subjects I will breach that I'm not really going to get into because either A, I'm a Arlington County employee, or B, because my personal thoughts on it mean we'll be talking for 3 hours, and I don't want to do that to you either. But there are a few things I want to touch on that could be their own programs as well. So we're going to start with some harmless ones. At least I think they're harmless. I don't feel that too many people base their everyday or even seasonal weather predictions, I would hope, on whether animals can actually predict the weather or not. I would hope that the majority of you know that no, animals really can't predict the weather. This is the most famous one here. This is Punxsutawney Phil. He's the famous woodchuck or groundhog or whistlepig or marmot, whatever you'd like to call them, that is trotted out every February 2nd to see its shadow. Probably the best cared for groundhog in the world, certainly top 10, if not the best. Definitely produces quite a audience every February 2nd, which is really surprising to me. And again, this is probably the most most quickly recognized, the most quickly thought of is, yeah, he comes out on February 2nd, looks to see his shadow, and we have more winter, we don't have winter. And I think that the woodchuck is 50-50 on that prognostication, which makes sense if you're thinking it's just same as chance. I found some really interesting sayings out there, like seagull, seagull, sit on the sand. It's never good weather when you're on land. These guys are standing right here on a very nice sunny day in Texas. Even the gulls have to take a break at some point from all the flying they do. So taking that with a grain of salt. And again, see, gulls are not I think the longest flyers to begin with. So it shouldn't really be concerning to find them on land. Another favorite is woolly bears, and the number of times someone has told me, hey, you know, if you look at the woolly bear and you look at the size of that red band, it can tell you, you know, what the weather's going to be like. You know, if that rusty band is really wide, it's going to be a mild winter. But if there's a lot of black and just like a narrow band, it's going to be a much more severe winter. Well, that is actually not untrue. It has some truth in it, but it's really more about what happened to that woolly bear than what is going to happen. So if you've got a wide band, very likely there was a mild winter. That woolly bear hatched early and began eating early, and so you get a much wider band from a longer span between when it emerges and when it goes into its cocoon. But if it's a shorter band, then it means it was a late, you know, longer winter, probably a little more intense, and got a later start in the growing season. But there's really no truth to that at all. And again, I hope that the group I'm talking with, that we would all agree on that ahead of time. Our bulls and certain other animals completely colorblind. This is another one where you know, the bulls don't see that red at all. They don't see red and get really excited. What they see is the movements of the matador, the movements of the cape that excites it. For some of these critters, they've already been probably primed to be aggressive and angry before they even get out in the arena. And so that's what you see there. So that red cape is really decoration. It's for the humans watching, but it has no impact on the bull's emotions or feelings when it comes out in there. It's reacting completely to the motions of the cape and the motions of the individual that's flipping that cape around and waving it at the bull. And then color blindness is really, to me, it's one of the more horribly named problems with vision, because it's rarely a complete lack of color. Oftentimes it's a problem with the cones in some way that makes it tough for the human or the animal to see or differentiate between certain kinds of colors, which may or may not be a problem. I think I read in Romania that if you are colorblind, they won't actually let you get a driver's license, which seems like an overreaction to me. But you've got two kinds of light sensing cells in your eyes. You've got rods, which are more sensitive to light, and they can also detect motion. And those are really important for nocturnal critters. And you've got cones, which differentiate colors. And for diurnal critters who use color as cue or use color to find food or to detect danger, that can be really important. And so you can see the difference in two different groups of birds. You've got diurnal birds, which use a lot of many species use a lot of color for communication. 80% of their receptors may be cones, where the opposite would be true in many owls, who have mostly rods, because they're out at night. It's really low light. They don't need to differentiate color. They need to see motion. They need to be more sensitive to light. Use as much light as possible. And so critters that are typically nocturnal tend to have less cones and more rods. And so in our household pets, like cats and like dogs, there's different degrees to their ability to detect color. I think, I'm trying to remember, but I think like dogs see more blues and yellows and maybe greens, but not as much red. They have trouble differentiating, maybe I think like reds and purples. But they're not completely colorblind, but they do see those colors in different shades. And I think as humans, we always start from that position of the way we see the world, the way that we experience the world is normal, and it's a different type of experiencing from the way other critters do. Some can see ultraviolet rays. Like some species of bees can see ultraviolet colors that we can't see on the flowers, that guide them into where the nectar is. So there's lots of different types of sight, and the receptors in the eyes can be very different between different species. But I think to say that they're colorblind or they see completely in grayscale, especially with dogs and cats, is very much incorrect. It's not an accurate way of looking at that. And it's something to consider. I read a really nice article on PetMD, and if you're interested more in this particular one, it's a good one to check out. Do bears hibernate? So you'll have people on both sides of this debate, but bears really don't hibernate. What they do is more of a torpor, and their body temperature does not drop nearly as much as something like, say, a woodchuck, where if you get a woodchuck, you've got a severe depression in its metabolic activity. Its body temperature drops perilously close to its surroundings, and if you pulled that out, you'd appear dead. There's a reason they don't tell you to disturb bears in their hibernaculum, and it's because they're not really hibernating. And if you wake one, it's not going to be happy with you. They go into torpor. It's much more similar to what chipmunks do. Chipmunks spend that whole summer storing food, and they'll sleep for several days at a time, wake up, have a meal, go into another chamber where they'll relieve themselves, and then go back to sleep. And so that's how they spend that winter underneath the snow, all packed into their neat little room. Bears don't store food. They eat tons and tons of food. Their caloric intake sharply increases about midsummer, say mid-July or so, and they eat tons and tons more food. They're trying to get their body fat reserves up, because they will not typically eat during this time, and so they need to make sure they've got reserves that are going to get them through the winter. And again, most of these are pretty harmless. You can't predict the weather with these animals. Okay, bears don't really hibernate. They torpor, so it's a term. They're still spending a lot of that winter sleeping. So all these different things aren't really that big a deal. This is another one. Lemmings. This is one I remember very much growing up. I can tell you the first time I read about lemmings, it was in this, oh, I wish I could remember the name of the book. There was this book that I really liked. I think I took out several times from my school library, and I thought it was just fascinating that these little critters would just run off a cliff, and what a bunch of silly, dumb little rodents. And it's so much more complex than that. This a lot of people point the finger to Walt Disney's White Wilderness. This is a 1958 film, and I think it actually won an award. It got a lot of really great reviews. It was a really outstanding for the time nature movie. I think there's evidence that this was actually staged. The lemmings in that movie, that image was actually staged, and that a couple others were actually staged as well, which is kind of disheartening and unfortunate. But the misinformation about lemmings goes back way earlier than Walt Disney. He just happened to walk into it at the right time, or whoever was directing this film. I also remember it being popularized in the Farsight. Excuse me. I can't really look at most scientific studies without thinking of some Farsight cartoon. And as much as I like the one on the left with the cannonball, the one that always sticks with me is the smug grin on that lemming with the little floaty around its waist in the cartoon on the right. So these are, and this is something I'll talk about with several more of the subjects as we go through, is that you have this information that comes out, and it may, it's incorrect or it's distorted or it's not entirely accurate, and then people run with it, or they hear what they want and they run with it, and that is what comes out of there. So it's I think in this day with the amount of media we get, I think we've all seen, especially with stories that might be really important to us, that the first headline that comes out is what people stick with or continue to think about, even though it later is proven, or more information comes out and it's untrue, but people still, sometimes they hear that one piece of information and that's all they hold on to, and that's all that's there, and it can't change. So sometimes getting that information out first is really important. Our story with the lemmings starts with Ziegler of Strasbourg, and I think this was maybe 15th century. It was a long time ago. Is well before I think even America was around. And he wrote that the lemmings were created by spontaneous generation. This was an old belief before people could find, certain kinds of eggs, or didn't see mating, or didn't see the young of certain critters. That organisms, like some plants, fungus and mold, but also many types of insects, just spontaneously generated out of other types of matter. And in this case, lemmings were spontaneously generated in the sky, and they were dropped onto the ground, and then when the grasses grew in the spring, they disappeared. Which is, honestly, I'm sorry, sometimes it just seems like it's like lazy guesswork or science, and it didn't work really hard there. Now this gentleman on the right, it looks like ole worm, but I'm pretty sure it's probably should be pronounced ole worm, or verm, ole verm perhaps. Was a pretty good skeptical thinker when it came to a lot of nature. I'll talk more about this guy probably next month, but he was one of the first to say that, to prove that unicorns aren't real, and that the horns of unicorns being sold as a cure for poisons was narwhal horns. Horns from, if you're not entirely sure what a narwhal is, it's a small whale or a large porpoise, I can't remember which, and they have one long horn off the tip of their nose. And whalers were catching these whales and cutting the horns off, and then sell them as unicorn horns with all these wonderful properties, like they could cure poisoning. So you think, hey, this guy's great. He saved the narwhals, and he's trying to get this information out that unicorns don't exist and they can't do that. And then he turned around and then still tested to see if these these narwhal horns would cure poisoning, by apparently poisoning several small mammals or pets, and then testing out the narwhal horn on them. As far as I know, they all survived, so he couldn't have poisoned them that much. But I don't know that there's any real property in the narwhal horn that would have saved them from a severe poisoning. But he also, sticking with the lemming story here, he didn't like Ziegler's story about the lemmings, but only the part that they fell out of the sky as a result of spontaneous generation. He was absolutely convinced that they were picked up by the wind and then dropped from the sky, and then they would disappear later on. But that they had a natural origin. Carl Linnaeus, who is considered the father of our modern taxonomy, he had did more research and shed more light on the on lemmings and their origin. And so we're at a point now where we know lemmings come from, that they're rodents. That was some of the research that both of them did. That Ole Worm was the first person to dissect a lemming, show that they were very similar to rodents. Carl Linnaeus did more work, so we know that the lemmings now have a natural origin. They're part of this group of animals called rodents, but we're still seeing them run off of cliffs and die, and I think there might even be some slight, if I was maybe reading into the article too much, that there was some slight distinction between the term suicide as here in the West versus in Europe, and what exactly that meant. But these critters would definitely go through these mass migrations, and they may, if there was too much density, population density, and they may try to cross bodies of water. In a small body of water where they eventually make it across, great. But a larger body of water, if they just jump in the water and start swimming because it's water and it turns out to be the ocean, they're not going to make it too far before they get exhausted and they drown. And so that is this idea of these lemmings running off cliffs and dying, came from the fact that they would either sometimes knock themselves off cliff during these migrations and fall in the water, or they would enter water trying to go to a new place, and they would get into a body of water that they were never going to have the ability to cross, and they would exhaust themselves and drown. This was, I believe, the narrator in White Wilderness, the Disney movie, actually said, but it's still somehow morphed into this. They're just jumping off cliffs and dying in the water. And that's what I remember learning and reading in several books in my younger days. There was also a story in the Popular Science Monthly, August 1877 edition. That's not the magazine. It's just a cover I could find. It's not this exact episode, but in the August 77 issue, they talked about how the lemmings would jump off the cliff and swim out into the ocean to look for the lost continent of Lemuria. And so that was a whole other addition to this story that was just fantabulous. And so there's a lot of steps to get to this point here, but again, the first time I remember hearing about it, they run off the cliffs and they just die, and it seemed nonsensical, but why would they do this? And so sometimes these are the questions we need to answer, and you'll find out that it's a lot more complex. Can we get warts from frogs or toads? I left this one in harmless because I don't think anyone believes it anymore. There may have been a time where frogs or toads were probably killed more than they could have been for this. I think most people understand now that that's not true. If you look at a toad, you got these large glands on the back of their head behind their eye, which actually do produce a toxin. And I think it's entirely possible that somebody could have roughly handled a toad and seen, maybe an exudate from these glands and thought, am I going to get warts from this? Because they got warts all over their body. But hopefully, we're all familiar with the human papillomavirus, which causes warts and is in fact unique to humans. So it's not something that we can get from the frogs or toads that they're carrying. It actually comes from human to human, or can be spread by human to human contact. And this one, which could seem really important, but is actually a myth. I've read that they prefer dirty hair. I've read they prefer clean hair. Head lice don't really care how much you wash your hair at all. Personal hygiene or cleanliness in the home or school has nothing to do with getting head lice, and that is directly from the CDC. There are some other factors into the spread of head lice, and there are some that are socioeconomic. There are some that are simply social. There are some that have to do with traits and things. But it is contact between individuals, and on a rare occasion, it can be the sharing of clothes as well. But it's really contact. Also, I just think that's a fantastic picture. It's one really gives you an idea of what those guys look like, and you see those hooks on the feet that they use to hold on to hair. But yeah, they don't care whether your hair is clean or dirty. They are just there to get in your hair, and they spend their whole life. Like, these guys don't come from some other critter. They don't come from some other place. They spend their entire life on humans, their whole life cycle. And so obviously they're finding enough people to get on around, and I think they have a pretty quick life cycle, and that's how they're able to do it. Are daddy longlegs the most poisonous spiders in the world? This is a triple no. They are not poisonous, they're venomous, they're not spiders, and they are not the most venomous in the world. They have mouth parts which can't pierce our skin. And so I think that's part of where some of this information came up. They really can't pierce through your skin and bite. They do have venom. Their venom is for securing, it's for catching other small invertebrates and eating them. And so a lot of times when you have a critter like this, that venom is really about that critter. And so because their prey is invertebrates, even if they could bite us and envenomate us, probably wouldn't have that much of an effect on us. There are some wasps that have a painful sting, and some wasps that don't have a very painful sting because their venom is very much about is just about catching other invertebrates. When you're playing with, when you're talking about a snake, that is venomous, that hunts small mammals, that venom is much more likely to be medically serious to you because we have much more in common with a small mammal like a mouse or a rabbit than we do with a small invertebrate that would be the prey of a daddy longlegs. It's always curious sometimes where these come up, and then I think because we live in now an internet age where people spend a lot of time surfing the web, somebody will dig one of these up and pop it out there, and then boom, suddenly everybody knows that daddy longlegs are the most poisonous spiders in the world. And so I get this one a lot, especially from kids, and I always want to make sure that I unpack it with all three pieces. That poison is something you get. Poison is something that affects you when you eat it. So venom needs to be injected by either fangs, by spur, by a stinger. That they aren't spiders. You can see they got one body part there instead of two main body regions, and definitely not the most venomous in the world. But if it gets you to look at daddy longlegs a little differently, I guess it couldn't totally hurt. And again, whenever I've read this, it's always about, they can't bite you, so they can't affect you. I always wonder if that scares some people off from daddy longlegs. And some myths have been used as motivation. I wanted to share this clip from one of my new favorite shows, real quick here.
Hey, Sam, come here a sec.
Coach, I'm sorry.
You know what the happiest animal on earth is? It's a goldfish. You know why?
No.
It's got a 10-second memory. Be a goldfish, Sam. Yeah?
So I hope everybody heard that. That's why I went back and restarted, was to make sure that the sound would come through. This is another one that I've heard a lot of. And do goldfish have a memory span that can be measured in seconds? When I first heard this, it was a goldfish does a lap around its tank, and by the time it gets around, it's all new to it all over again. And this is not entirely true. I read some articles where goldfish were taught to poke a lever in order to get food, and then the time that food could be released was restricted to like 1 hour a day. And the goldfish would try it occasionally, but they knew that lever was where food is, and they started to also cue into when that time is. And the minute that you can say that, you see that those goldfish are coming around at a certain time of day to get that food and know that that's the time that they can use the lever, you're way beyond a memory span of seconds. Or the ability to form new memories that last longer than seconds. And so this is definitely an incorrect myth. And again, I don't know that this hurts or harms anybody, but it's one of those things. I love that show, Ted Lasso, and it's pretty positive. It's got a little salty language in it, but generally it's funny, it makes me laugh. And just that idea that that player in the clip before that made a mistake in training, and somebody got into him, and he just calls him over. He's like, "Be a goldfish. Forget that happened. Move on." And I always thought that was really neat. And again, these are the kind of things where I'm like, some of these seem pretty harmless, and people can have a lot of fun with goldfish, and I like that a lot. I really enjoy this little meme I found here as well. But generally, they are not. And the other thing is they're just not that dumb. They might not be smart as us, but they have different kind of intelligence. They have some intelligence for time. They have some intelligence to learn these new things. They've also talked about how, not the goldfish that use the lever, but other goldfish can be seen. They know there's a certain time when you feed them. They'll do that. Goldfish, that if you try to catch a goldfish, especially goldfish out of a pond, I used to do this when I worked at Reston. We had a lot of goldfish in a pond there, and the ones that you didn't catch got a whole lot smarter about what you were trying to do if you missed them with that net the first time, and they learned from those encounters as well. So goldfish are not as foolish or as poor in the memory as they're often given credit for. Oops. Oops, that's not the one. So, will parent birds abandon eggs and babies if they smell humans? This is one I still encounter. We get calls a lot, especially in the spring. People find fawns, squirrels fall out of their nests, birds fall out of their nests. All these young birds, especially during the time when they've got their adult wings and are trying to learn how to fly, mistakes will be made. Birds will end up on the ground. And I always tell people they can't. Many of them probably can't even smell, let alone smell you. They have very poor sense of smell. On the whole, most birds don't smell very well at all. It's the reason that great horned owls are the main predator for striped skunks. Okay, turkey vultures, black vultures, those are the exceptions. There's a definite advantage for them to smell because they're looking for dead stuff, and dead stuff stinks. So they're really good at finding that. But these guys here, on the right, we got some barn swallows that haven't quite left the nest yet. On the left, these are, they're not bluebird eggs. I think they're chickadee eggs. If something happened to one of these, if the bird fell out and you can put it back in the nest, put it back in the nest. Mom, dad, not going to care. They're still going to feed it and take care of it. The same with these eggs. Sometimes if a nest falls out and you can't put it back to where it was, but you can put it somewhere else safe and high, the birds will finish taking care of their young in there. Don't let that be a parameter to helping if you can. I'm not a big fan of interfering with predators. That's a whole different story. But if something happens, especially if it's something that's human caused, and you can help that little bird or that egg, by all means, please do it. Excuse me. Something else I was going to say, I think, about smell. The other thing to be important is, the other thing to remember is, a lot of times they'll fall out, and then you're standing there and you're looking around and there's no parents to be seen. Well, of course there's no parents to be seen. You next to a baby bird is like a Tyrannosaurus next to a person. You are a large, scary looking, probably predatory critter in their mind, and you're standing right over their young. And as much as they want to help their young, they're not going to come and do it when you can reach down and grab them. And that's what they, and that might be the impression that they have. So I always try to tell people, if you don't see, especially with fawns, you're not going to see mom around because she's waiting for you to leave before it's safe for her to come get her young. So the longer you stand there, the longer you're a distraction or a potential threat, the longer it's going to take for mom or dad or one of the parents to come and check on the young. So giving them the space is great. And of course, birds fall out of nests a lot. If you or somebody in the neighborhood has an outdoor cat, by all means, if you can secure them until that bird gets safely away, that would be great too. Bats. I want to make a special note here. Bats come out at night. Night has historically, going back centuries, been a scary time because remember those rods and cones? We don't quite have as many rods as some other critters do, and so night can be a tougher time for us to see. It can be scary. A lot of things traditionally been thought about what the dark means, and then you look at critters that come out at night, like bats, and there end up being a lot of superstitions, a lot of myths about them, and some of those are rooted simply in as fear, from things like bats and black cats being the familiars of witches and other evil things, and then a lot of times you'll find that people just focus on things like vampire bats, and that's one bat. Actually, I'm sorry, I think that's like 3 species of bat that will actually nip on mammals and lap up their blood. And I feel like they don't typically do it to humans. There might be one that's more likely to do it than the other 3, but generally bats are pretty innocuous to people. Some of them are actually pollinators, can be really important, but they get some a bad rap, some thoughts of evil, which again isn't fair. They're simply nocturnal creatures doing what they do. And there are bats have some pretty standard myths about them that I think there's been a lot of work done by groups, especially some. There's one called Bat Conservation International, BCI, which has a lot of great information about bats, a lot of great resources, and certainly worth a Google if you're more interested in bats, about different types of bats and how important they are. In Virginia, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I was going to say 7. There are 8 different types of bats that are, I think, regularly seen. And the 3 with asterisks, I think, are either state endangered, threatened, or endangered. I'm surprised that that's not with the little brown bat, but these critters hide out in caves. That's another thing that cave is a dark, scary place. Also, they prefer the dark, and that just for centuries that was something that could be considered very mistrustful, make them very mistrustful in the eyes of humans who don't have that comfort in the dark that some of these critters do. Most of the bats you'll find around here, in fact, I think all these bats are insect-eating bats, which means they use echolocation. Bat on the left here is a Mexican free-tail bat. The right is one of the fruit bats. You see they have very different eyes. A very large eye right here, not as big an eye right here. But this bat on the left is going to use echolocation to find its food and to help with navigating. But they're not blind; they can still see. So they aren't going to do things like get in your hair. As far as myths go, that's one of the most fantastic. That bats have nothing better to do than get stuck in your hair, or are so dumb as to get stuck in your hair. I just one of those ones where I still had somebody in this day and age come be like, "Don't they get stuck in your hair?" I was like, "No." And it should also be one of those things where you can ask around and you find that nobody's had that issue. So again, the bat on the left uses echolocation, still has eyes, and can see. Those eyes may not be as sharp or as good as the bat on the right, which does not use echolocation because fruit doesn't fly away from you or run away. And so, you got eyes that are probably much better at night on that fruit bat than on the free-tail bat on the left. So different means of finding their food because they have different types of food. Do bats have rabies? This one still comes up as well. Bats can have rabies. Bats can also carry rabies, but an animal that has rabies, whether it's a raccoon, whether it's a bat, there's a lot that come up, and people always are just like, oh, that animal has rabies. Rabies is a deadly disease that has I think a near 100% fatality rate. Even in humans, it's very important if you come in contact with a bat or any other animal that might be potentially have rabies, that if you can get the animal test or if you can get yourself tested or checked, it's important to do that before things get much, much worse. But do bats have rabies? They can. You'll notice this person who is handling the bat has a protective glove on so that they don't get get bit by the bats. I was going to do bat research and I never got to, but I was going to help out with it. When I lived in Cleveland, and the person who ran that study was like, you need to get your rabies vaccination. You need to get their vaccination up. And he had his, and you get this titers checked every year to make sure that, because yes, you need to be safe. It's a group that's known to have this within the population. But do all bats have rabies? No. But you can argue that they have a higher incidence. This would be the one myth where I'm like, maybe this one wasn't harmless. Are bats blind? Well, they're blind, and I don't think that affects the way people see them. But do bats have rabies? This could be one that has that effect. And as far as being popularized in pop culture, that's how Cujo, which when I was a kid, any kind of angry dog got called Cujo. That was just like I just remember that very distinctly. That name was around a lot. But the story of Cujo started with the dog getting bit by a bat. It stuck its nose in somewhere. A bat bit the dog on the nose, and the owners didn't know, and he gradually got rabies. So it can definitely be impactful to people, but I don't know that this kind of thing happens very often between bats and other critters. If you see a bat, I feel like I need to say this. The two pieces of thing. If you ever find a bat in your house and you can contain that bat and even catch it, so it can be tested, that's important, because sometimes people can get bit and they don't know. It sounds really scary, but I want to emphasize, this is a deadly disease. If you find a bat that is not acting normal, it's out during the day, or it's low and in an area that's not where you normally expect one, don't handle it. Don't pick it up. Don't touch it, because it could very well be sick. It's just and I mentioned at the beginning, having rational thought and thinking smartly. This is also one of the things where if that bat is, and any animal, any mammal really, if they're not acting in a way that seems like they are healthy or in their right mind, then give them some space. Don't mess with them. Don't get involved, or stay away and take care of yourself, please. Some myths that are harmful to us. This one, I never really thought about this before. I was looking through some different myths, and this one popped out at me. I remember, if you leave a bee alone, it won't bother you. Well, when I was a kid, I was trying to leave a bumblebee alone, and I got stung 3 times. So that didn't work very well out for me. But with wasps, for sure, even if you leave them alone, even if you're not being menacing, sometimes you can get tagged, especially at the end of the season when ground nesting yellow jackets are making their reproductives, are producing the males and the winged females. It's a very, very easy way to get tagged. Just accidentally stepping on their on or near their nest site. So definitely be careful around these critters. It's something to keep an eye out for, whether if you have an idea where they come out, or if you're heading off trail where less people have walked. It's just something to be careful of. I know a lot of people have many different stories about that. But but don't think that you can just leave a wasp alone and it's going to leave you alone. You never know what's going on in their tiny little heads. This is one that could have a little political charge to it, but I felt the need to throw this out there because it's something that was out there for so long, and I felt that this was harmful more to people than the monkeys, because I felt that there was an undercurrent of. I just think that there's an undercurrent of prejudice and even racism in the story, because it's thought that HIV came from Africa. It's thought that somebody had this kind of an encounter with a monkey, and that's what happened. What's far more likely as a result, and again, I don't think patient 0 has ever been identified as far as HIV, which is now, obviously it's a global disease, is that it was bushmeat. There's a lot of different things that get eaten out in the bush. It's a really it's horrible for the critters that are there, but I mean, it's there's food out there, and it's when you don't have a lot of money, it's far cheaper to go catch something in the woods than it is to go buy it at a store. But you can see a lot of different critters hanging up here, and monkeys are among the type of bushmeat that's out there. And if you have an interaction with that monkey where you get injured, or you cut yourself while you're preparing the bushmeat, that's a blood to blood interaction right there that could easily lead to an infection, and it's thought that is probably the most likely culprit for the introduction of HIV into the human population. So if you go from having, you caught a monkey and you have a meal and you got yourself cut a little while you're doing it, next, decades later, you have a global health crisis. So it's just some of these simple things. And again, this obviously can't be very sanitary, and a lot of different reasons there. Or even preparing it later, you can still get cut and have that mix of the blood. So just this is something to be careful about. And I think there's lots of rules against bushmeat, and there's a lot of campaigns to reduce this kind of thing happening. But it still happens, and it happens a lot, and it's a potential for pathway for something like HIV to happen again. Incidentally, I want to point out this is a pangolin here. We're going to come back to them a little bit later. Harmful to animals. There are, talked about bats, and they come out at night, and they have they can have this sinister reputation. I think snakes have that reputation a lot more. And it's that myth right there at the top: are all snakes venomous? That is part of the reason that snakes have this reputation. And so a lot of people, I know people that no matter what I say to them, still in the back of their head, they're like, "Oh, a good snake's a dead snake." There are people that don't like snakes, and snakes and spiders both suffer from these kinds of reps. They're both animals that can have venom. I'm going to come back to that. Not all snakes are venomous, but all spiders are venomous. There's a very small few exception, but for the most part, they're all venomous. But again, is that venom something that can affect us? And that's a real question. But starting with the assumption from the myth that all that venom can affect us is problematic for the critters, especially. one myth that I don't know that has anything to do with excuse me, human interaction with it, but I always find amusing is that snakes hypnotize their prey. There are tons of myths. If you go online and look up snake myths, you'll have your fill. And if you do a really good search for it, you'll also find that there's snake myths in other parts of the world that have never cropped up here that interpreters and educators have to fight in other areas of the world as well. That misinformation as well. But snakes hypnotize their prey. Well, snakes can't blink. They have a clear scale that covers their eye, so they don't blink. And if you've ever talked to somebody who doesn't blink or doesn't blink very often, it can be very disconcerting. It can be very intense. And snakes don't blink, and so when they're staring down their prey and they're keeping an eye on it to get their food, it can appear as if they're hypnotizing, especially if the prey doesn't move, because the prey's thinking, if I don't move, I won't get eaten. So you got a combination of the prey trying to not move, to not get eaten and not be seen by the snake, and the snake staring down its prey because that's what it's going to eat and that's what it's focused on. So you have that combination of these two things, and you end up with a myth like, do snakes hypnotize their prey? I think not nearly as damaging to a snake's reputation as, are all snakes poisonous? And I still see this again, as I mentioned earlier. Snakes aren't poisonous, they're venomous. Snakes have venom, they inject it into their prey. Some snakes do. This is a copperhead. This is from right here in Gulf Branch. Well, right here, I'm not in Gulf Branch now, but right in our park in Gulf Branch. But it's actually not the only venomous snake that you're going to find in Arlington. There is some recent evidence that shows that garter snakes have some a very mild venom in their saliva, as do ringneck snakes. Ringneck snakes are small. Most of them are 24 inches would be a big ringneck snake. Probably most of them are under 18 inches. And most of the small ones don't have a mouth with teeth big enough or strong enough to bite through our skin. Our skin is actually a pretty good protection. Um, the other thing is that venom is for small invertebrates, maybe some small vertebrates, but likely invertebrates and small vertebrates, and it's not really for mammals of any type. So even if they could bite us, maybe you get a slight reaction, but probably nothing really intense. And the ringneck snakes have rear fangs. Their fangs are towards the rear of their mouth. They're not at the front like the typical venomous snake that you would think of. And so they have to be able to bite, get their teeth through your skin, and then really, really chew on your finger in order to get that through. So that is one of the reasons that you're probably not going to have too much of a, you don't have to worry about the ringneck snake. And the garter snake, even if it gets a good bite on you, they're bigger and they can puncture your skin. You might have a little reaction, but it'd be an irritation, maybe a little extra swelling, but that's about it. For the most part, and the other thing too to remember is the venom is for the prey. The venom is not for you. Biting might be for you as a defensive reaction if they can't do anything else, if they can't get away. If you're handling them carelessly and they give you a bite. I read an article where they did some research on, I think it was copperheads and water moccasins. I don't know if they included any of the North American rattlesnakes, but they found that like 50 to 60% of the time they dry bite, because again, they don't want to use the venom on you. You're not food. They're not going to try to kill you. They're just biting you to say let go. And many of them, they can control how much venom they release, and they often don't release they may not release the venom because you're not a prey item. You're not a food item, and so they're not trying to envenomate you to eat. All right, so I said snakes aren't poisonous, they're venomous. This is one of the few snakes that is poisonous because of its diet. It is venomous, and then I forget if is it shellfish that it eats or is it some invertebrates? But this is the tiger keelback, and they are actually both venomous and poisonous. But for the most part, when people talk about snakes as poisonous, it's fair to correct them and remind them the difference between venom and poison, and then still say that there's probably a good chance that snake's not venomous. There are a lot of snakes that aren't venomous around here. Many more snakes are non-venomous than are venomous, and then harmful to both. This is one of those ones. Sharks. I grew up in a time shortly after the novel and the movie came out, and this really changed people's perception. I think not just of sharks, but sometimes of swimming. I will be honest with you, I can't help myself. If I go swimming somewhere, I'll check to see if it's got any connection in the ocean. I'll check to see if it's got sharks, has ever had sharks in it. I check the Connecticut River. I checked the Chesapeake Bay. I really wish I hadn't checked either one because, of course, I got stories about sharks being upriver. There are some sharks that can do well in brackish or even fresh water for, not a too long period of time. And so, it's always kind of an interesting thing. But, perception of sharks and especially from this movie really, changed how people view swimming in the water. So, and again, they're often depicted like this mouth agape, their teeth showing, or many rows of teeth showing. And just these mindless killing and eating machines. One of the myths about them is if they stop swimming, they'll sink and die because they can't get water over their gills to breathe. And some sharks, like the nurse shark, pictured here, are actually very good at circulating water over their gills so that they can get oxygen to their gills even when they're resting. And some sharks will sink, but it doesn't mean that they're going to die. Their bodies are actually pretty tough to compress, and they can resist that. But generally, yeah, many sharks do need to swim in order to get water over their gills so they can get oxygen. But let's be honest. The real question you want to know is, can a shark really take 3 barrels down underwater with it? I'm just kidding. The really question you want to know is, well, what's the deal with smelling blood? Well, the piece to remember here is if blood is in the water, those molecules of blood need to travel through the water to the point where they can be picked up by a shark. So that needs to be in the water and needs to drift. It's not quite as, and doesn't, that transmission is not going to happen as fast as it would in the air. But many sharks can detect one blood in water at a concentration of 1 part per billion, or 1 part per 10 billion, which is mind-blowing to me. It's so distinct. But again, that's like a drop of blood in an Olympic-sized pool. What that also means, though, is you'll read often that sharks can detect a drop of blood miles away, and it's not really true, but they can get there from a few football fields away. So they can be still pretty far away from whatever might be bleeding in the water and sense that and track it back and go check it out. This is again a question. This is again a quality that gets thrown out there because it's scary and it's terrifying. And don't bleed if you're in the water. And it leads back to sharks as man-eaters and sharks as scary killers. But there's a lot of interesting things about the shark. First of all, their olfactory bulb is huge, so they do depend on a lot of smell. You can see it compared to an alligator and a horse here. But they have some other senses that, I think often get overlooked. Like other fish, they have a lateral line system. This is a sensory detection on the skin that helps the shark detect changes in pressure and speed of water, and so they can feel what's moving around them in the water, because water obviously is denser than air, and so they can feel movement in the water and they can detect it as well. They also have electroreceptors. I'm a big sucker for just really neat words, and ampullae of Lorenzini is one of those that always sticks in my head. Whenever I think about sharks, I think about that. But these are, and this is the lateral line too, so you've got a lot mapped here. I think the red dots are the ampullae, and then the red lines are the lateral line, but the canals. But this is all, these are all sensory receptors on the shark's head that help it detect the change in water pressure and different and movement in the water, and then the electroreceptors as well. And I think some sharks can detect something down to like 5 nanovolts. So they can detect really minute electrical charges. And again, water transmits electricity much more readily than air does, and so there are a lot of aquatic animals that have electroreceptors. I don't think you find that in any terrestrial organisms. This is pretty much an aquatic organism sensory receptor that you're going to find more often. And I want to address this too, because you hear this a lot. Sharks don't get cancer. Well, yeah, they do. Here's a great white, and look at that lip. That's cancer. And several of these pictures of pictures of different types like this have sort of around. This is the direct here in the upper left. This is the actual headline from NBCnews.com of this article. So where did the idea that sharks don't get cancer come from? Well, they don't get it a lot, but they do get it. They tend to be a little more resistant to it for several reasons. But this idea that sharks don't get cancer come from somebody trying to sell a book and some dubious claims about the treatment using shark cartilage. So you may want to take that fact with the grain of salt that it deserves, because I don't know that any of these treatments have been there. And again, I am not a medical health professional, and I'm not going to give anybody advice. But I feel like this doesn't quite pass that baloney detector test. Speaking of baloney detector, these are pangolins. These are cool critters. I think they're the only mammal that are covered with scales of keratin. There are 8 extant species that are still with us. Every one of these species is at least threatened. 3 are critically endangered. If you remember that picture earlier with the bushmeat, that's one reason. Apparently they taste quite well. There is a huge market for their scales in certain countries in Asia, because they are used in traditional medicine. And again, this is the point where I'm going to, the way they're used in traditional medicine has not been proven scientifically. Okay, and like I said, I could get, if I take my hat off and just I'm Ken, I happily have lots of discussions with anybody about this if they want to. But what they're essentially being killed for is either food or medicine that is not proven to work, or marital aids. Let's just put it that way, because I saw some youngsters earlier, and I want to make sure I'm being polite. But they're killed, and there's no proof that that works either. So these critters, unfortunately, which are beautiful, beautiful, and fantastic, are really struggling in the wild. They're considered right now the most trafficked organism. I think they estimate there's like 100,000 every year that get caught and killed and shipped around. And so they're heavily protected for the good that does, but they're highly poached and they're highly trafficked. And I think over the last 10 years, an average of 100,000, that's over 1 million of these that have been removed from the wild for reasons that may or may not actually be good. And speaking of which, we can go ahead and ditto the rhinoceros on that one as well, because rhinos are poached, and there's habitat and there's encroachment from other species. Apparently, elephants can move in and be a problem for rhinos, because rhinos feed very specifically on like dwarf shrubs, and elephants can move into areas and they're not picky, so they'll eat those, but they'll eat everything else, and they can be competitive with the rhinos in those areas. But the main problem for rhinos is poaching for their horns. The horns have been used for ornaments, for cups. They're grind down into a dust again for male enhancement, and there's no real evidence that works either. So they're being, and they're both. This is I think the black rhinos on top and the white rhinos on the bottom in this image, and they're both I think critically endangered as well. There's breeding plans for rhinos around in several different zoos, and again, it's misinformation, stuff that doesn't work, and they're getting killed for it. I find that really frustrating. I hate to end on that note, but that's kind of where we're at here at the point. So, what's the harm with the information? Some of it is harmless. Some of it can be interesting and fun, or a laugh, like this guy right here. But some of it can be really, disheartening. And it's important to have the correct information out there, and so that people don't try to take advantage of or catch these critters when there's no real advantage behind it. I get, I can, on some level, I can understand the idea of bushmeat and cheaply getting food from your surroundings. But the other stuff really, I can find really, really pretty frustrating. So thank you for joining me. I see. Oh, that's my transcript. It was interesting. I thought that was the chat. So does anybody have any questions? You're all very quiet. I hope I didn't put anybody to sleep. I'm actually going to check the chat and see if there are any questions. Oh, there aren't any. Oh. Does anybody have any questions, comments, their favorite myth they want to throw out there? It's 8:01. If not, I will thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
No worries. Thanks for joining me tonight. I love doing these.
For the snake that you mentioned that was poisonous venomous, is that, where does that live?
That's a great question. I'm gonna stall and I'm gonna pull that up again. I feel like, is it Europe? That's a really good question. I can find that on Wikipedia real quick. Tiger keelback. East Asia and Southeast Asia.
I'm sorry. What is it called again?
It is called the tiger keelback. Is one of the common names, and it eats small invertebrates, especially frogs and toads. And I think, yeah, poisonous toads are what it eats, and then it kind of sequesters the toxins and becomes toxic itself.
Neat. Well, thank you so
Yeah,
much.
it's pretty cool.
I'm sorry I was late, but it's really been great. Thank you.
No worries. You can catch the beginning on the video when I send it out.
I intend to do that. I've been doing that. Thank you.
Oh, great. No worries, Eileen. Thanks. Have a good night.
Bye-bye.
All right, folks. Well, y'all have a good evening. Unless you have any questions, I'm going to take off. Have a great one, and thanks for joining me again tonight.